Good morning. Hope everyone is well. Thank you so much for joining us to share in this very important release of groundbreaking research by the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center. My name is Stacey Ellison. I'm the Director of Development and Communications for the organization. And again, we're so pleased that you took the time to join us this morning. We are going to get right to it, because we know everyone is very busy and very zoomed out. So we are going to just move right into the important information we have to share with you this morning. And with that, I am going to toss it over to Roy Miller of the Children's Campaign, who is such a valued mission partner in this work. We are so grateful that the Children's Campaign and Roy joins us, and I'm going to toss it right over to him to share.
I just want to welcome everybody and just introduce the panelists and just put a couple of things into perspective before we get started. This has been an effort over many years to bring the plight and the needs of girls forward in the state of Florida. With the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center and the Children's Campaign working together, we've accomplished some high-level accomplishments. We've passed gender-specific legislation, the second state in the country to do that, requiring gender-specific services. We've closed abusive institutions for girls, which required not only encouraging the formation of a grand jury to investigate the abusive institution, but also working with the legislature to eliminate it from the budget. We've promoted civil citations as an alternative to arrest, which keeps a lot of kids from becoming arrested. And then we've also worked together to expunge records earlier, lowering the age of expungement. Two more recent accomplishments where we were able to ban child marriage in the state of Florida. Before the ban, children of any age could get married in the state of Florida, and it was horrific. And then more recently, we've implemented with our partner Voices for Florida, a vision that was actually created by the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center and the Children's Campaign, and that was Open Doors, which is a survivor-led network of services to sex-trafficked children and young adults. The Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center over the last couple of years has actually produced several groundbreaking reports, which draws attention and alarm to the health status of girls in Florida and what they're facing and what they don't get. This latest report takes another big step, and it looks at the disproportionate discipline, the disproportionate involvement of Black girls and child welfare in the juvenile justice system. And that's going to be the emphasis of today's press conference. And you've received that information. After the panelists speak, we'll be opening the forum to questions. I'm just going to very quickly announce the panelists. I'm not going to go into a long description. They all have very impressive educational backgrounds and professional pedigrees, but just so you know who the players are. And these bios are available to people. Vicki Basra is going to speak first, and she's the president and CEO of the host organization, the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center. She's nationally recognized as an advocate for girls' rights. She's got 20 years of nonprofit leadership. She's adept at research as well as operations. She's helped implement the Open Doors Outreach Network vision. She holds a master's degree from the University of Tennessee, and she's working on her doctorate in social work from the University of Tennessee. The primary researcher on this project is Vanessa Patino. She's received her PhD last year. She's the Vice President of Research and Planning at the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center. And it's been my pleasure to work with her on numerous research reports that are very groundbreaking. She has both national and state perspectives, having worked at the National Council on Crime and Delinquency before joining the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center. Her cohort in research is Vanessa, spelled with an I, not an A, Gordon. She's the research project manager for the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center. And in addition to having worked for the Arthur Ashe Institute at Urban Health in Brooklyn, which makes her a big fan of mine because Arthur Ashe was one of my big heroes as I was growing up playing tennis. She received her bachelor's degree from Washington Adventist University and her master's from Long Island University in Brooklyn. And finally, we have Dr. Nicole Mason, who has stepped into the role in November 2019, being one of the youngest leaders in the country of a major think tank inside the Beltway, in her role as the executive officer of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She's also vice president of the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center, and are very fortunate to have her on its governance board. She's an author. She's frequently featured on major news organizations. The New York Times has published her material, and Dr. Mason is a recognized national expert. These are your presenters and leaders today. And so now, having introduced all of the speakers, I'll turn it over to the president and CEO of the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center, Vicki Basra.
Thank you, Roy. I appreciate the great introduction this morning. Good morning. As Roy said, I'm Vicki Basra, President, CEO of the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center. The Policy Center was founded by Dr. Lawanda Rivora and is a nationally recognized nonprofit organization and an outgrowth of the Justice for Girls movement that began in Florida almost 20 years ago. Our mission is to engage communities, organizations, and individuals through quality research, advocacy, training, and model programming to advance the rights of girls, young women, and youth who identify as female, especially those that are impacted by the juvenile justice system. The goal of the Policy Center's girl-centered research is to make sure our policies, programs, and services are informed by the best available data trends and are grounded in the experiences of girls and young women. Our research teams monitor the experiences of system-involved girls in many ways, including directly contacting girls who are navigating systems and its barriers, collecting information from staff that work directly with girls, participating in community meetings, reviewing policies and statutes on an ongoing basis, talking with experts in the field, and of course, monitoring data trends. Again, the research works to ensure we provide girls with the most timely, relevant, and effective and impactful services we can. That includes advocating for policy changes at the local and state levels with and on behalf of girls. Our mission is supported by the Children's Campaign, our advocacy partner organization in this work, who we are very grateful to. Our latest research report, which I am really excited about releasing today, Sounding the Alarm, the Criminalization of Black Girls, supports a simple fact. While Black girls do not misbehave any more than their peers, they are being punished more harshly. The results? More Black girls than any other racial or ethnic group are suspended, arrested, and jailed. The goal of this research is to bring to light these glaring disparities in our community so that lawmakers, educators, and the justice system can be involved to make the critical changes so that Black girls are treated fairly and equitably. The Policy Center's work is girl-centered, and our desire is that everyone will see the girl through the lens of her lived experience and for her potential, not to judge her by her present behavior and her circumstances. This report digs deep into data with lots of statistics and a lot of charts. But what I want you to remember is that every number represents a real life, a real girl, a real family. that are living through trauma of unjust systems that are contributing to harmful cycles of isolation, exclusion, and the criminalization of Black girls in our community and schools. For an overview of the report and findings, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vanessa Patino Lydia, the Policy Center's lead researcher.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Vanessa Patino Lydia, and I am the Vice President of Research at the Dolores Bar Weaver Policy Center. I conducted this research with my colleague, Vanessa Gordon, to investigate the critical points in the system that continue to create disparities for Black girls, specifically to better understand why they continue to be arrested and sent to lockup facilities at higher rates than their peers. Black girls represent 21% of the girls living in Florida, but they represent half of the girls involved in the juvenile justice system. We dug into the data and uncovered that Black girls in particular are experiencing unfair and inequitable treatment that jeopardizes their well-being and future opportunities. We hope these findings will mobilize communities and systems to examine their practices and policies that push Black girls deeper into the system. Here are 3 critical takeaways from the study. The first, school is a major entry point for Black girls in the juvenile justice system. And here's some data to support that. Black girls in Florida accounted for half of the almost 50,000 girls suspended from school. Black girls represented almost half of the girls who made contact with law enforcement in schools for incidents that were eligible for an alternative to arrest, such as a civil citation. And the majority of these incidents were for fighting, but charged as an assault and battery or disorderly conduct. Over the last 5 years, police arrested 1 in 4 Black girls in school instead of issuing a much lesser penalty like a civil citation when they were eligible for it. And one of the most interesting findings to support the impact of schools on the juvenile justice system trajectory for girls is this graph right here. If you look at the purple line, that line represents the 2018-19 school year. The green line represents the 2019-2020 school year, last school year, which we all know in March, we closed our schools from March to June of 2020. If you look at the green line, you'll see from April to May, June on the very bottom, how much reduction there was in terms of contact with law enforcement compared to the year before in the purple line. This resulted, the school closures during this time resulted in at least 250 fewer Black girls interacting with law enforcement in schools in that period alone compared to the year prior, just in those 3 months. Second critical takeaway, young Black girls are entering the juvenile justice system at significantly greater rates than their peers. Last year in Florida, police arrested over 500 girls who were ages 12 or younger. 55% of them were Black. And of the girls who were arrested that were under the age of 10, 83% were Black. If you look at this bar graph, the first line, you'll see that police arrested 7 girls under the age of 10 and charged them with a felony offense. All of them, all of the girls that were charged with a felony offense were Black girls under the age of 10. Last year in 2019-20, the youngest girl arrested in Florida was a 6-year-old Black girl. Third critical takeaway, the responses to Black girls vary from county to county. We found that a quarter of the counties in Florida have a high overrepresentation of Black girls that are being arrested or incarcerated. And the average length of stay for lockup is about 6 to 9 months for each girl that is sent away from her community. So this table shows the 15 counties that we identified as having high overrepresentation. If you look at Alachua County, which is the first line, you'll see that Black girls represent 1 in 3 of the general population, 34%. However, of all of the girls arrested, Black girls represent 82% of the arrests in Alachua County, and they represent 100% of all the girls that were incarcerated from Alachua County. Ten counties arrested more than 10 Black girls who were ages 12 and younger. These practices have resulted in over 3,000 Black girls impacted by the system last year alone. The numbers were sobering for our team, and we know that sharing them is an important step to raising community awareness about the criminalization of Black girls. Our data provides evidence of adultification bias, of harsher responses to girls, and of the policies and practices that are resulting in inequitable treatment. Disseminating this research is key to galvanizing community and policymaker support. The goal is to make lasting, impactful changes that will ensure that Black girls' lives are valued, their experiences are understood, and their treatment is equitable. I'd like to call on the Policy Center's Board Vice Chair, Dr. C. Nicole Mason, to share the actionable steps we recommend to begin to address this problem.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that really fantastic presentation. My name is Nicole, and I lead the Institute for Women's Policy Research and a proud board member of the center. I want to start out, before I get into the legislative actions, by providing a little bit of context for the report in the session, that the conference. So 30 years ago, I was a teenage Black girl growing up in a lower income neighborhood with failing schools, raised by a single mom. There was, I experienced a lot of trauma, and in many instances, school was one of the few places where I could go where I had a break from a lot of what was happening at home. The response by the school was not to penalize me for not showing up to class, penalize me for what I was wearing or outbursts, but to provide critical services and counseling so that I could, me and girls like me could get the necessary support and assistance that they need. A lot of what the report has to say seems normal these days. But what I want to point out is 30 years ago, 20 years ago, this was not the case. Since 1970, the suspension rate has more than doubled. The treatment of girls and Black youth within schools, the suspension rate that is not normal. And when I think about the report and the urgency of the report and how heartbreaking it is, regarding the statistics that Vanessa shared, I want us to know and understand that this is not normal and we shouldn't normalize it. And there's a lot of work that we must do both at the legislative level as well as the community level to reverse some of these very damaging trends. Because if we don't, I think what we will see, and we are seeing, that we're going to lose a generation of girls to the criminal legal system, and it doesn't have to be that way. I think about myself and understand that if I didn't have the support of counselors, like literally being able to go there and talk to counselors, and the response to me was not punitive or to arrest me, I wouldn't be here talking to you today about this report, and I wouldn't have become the doctor that I am, being able to share with you my experience in this moment. So I want to just share some of the legislative and policy recommendations and community level recommendations that the report that emerged as a part of the report, and also understand that Florida is not unique in facing this crisis and problem, that it is happening nationally. But what I'm excited about is we are starting to connect the dots more fully and really engage communities in alternative responses. So legislatively, there are a few things that we want to highlight. And the first is to ban suspensions of children in pre-K to third grade and invest in alternatives to a suspension. And I want to say, because I teach a course on this, it's not, people always ask, you know, what should we be doing? We actually know what to do, because in predominantly white schools and neighborhoods, we're having a different response to kids who have behavioral issues. We're just not making those same kind of considerations when people are Black and brown. The second thing is to ban arrest for youth under the age of 12 unless they are an imminent threat or serious harm to another individual. At the community level, it's really important for us to use civil citation as an alternative to arrest. The other thing is that we'd like to see is the implementation of protocols between school and law enforcement that more clearly define the roles of school resource officers and law enforcement to lessen suspensions and expulsions and overcriminalization of students. There also needs to be clear training of student resources officers on issues like implicit bias and de-escalation, so that they can better understand and know how to support students. And also making sure that there are mental health services in schools that match the resources dedicated to school resources officers or policing students, making sure that we are taking a holistic approach to keeping students healthy and safe. Secondly, I want to talk about using the data about what we know about Black girls to inform decisions. So the information and data that Vanessa presented should be a call to action, and we, ask some tough questions about why the data looks the way that it does, and make swift corrective action to make changes. The data, we can let the data lead, and then also really being able to disaggregate data by gender and race, so that we can understand the extent of the problem across counties and within schools. And also, I would also add here, sorry, Vanessa, that disaggregating data by sexual orientation and gender identity, because that, again, a disproportionate number of LGBTQ students face arrest and suspension as well. Working also in communities to ensure that all school districts are tracking suspension data in a unified way. The bottom line is that if we can't quantify the problem, it's hard for us to solve it and identify strategies that will work for communities. And so tracking and making the data uniform will go a long way towards that effort. The other thing that I think is really critically important, and I can speak to this again as a young person, as a former young person, and how becoming engaged and involved in my community and the decision making really was really critical in my own development. So one of the recommendations that we have is to make sure that girls are involved and have a voice in what's happening in their schools, and able to share out their experiences with the system, with student resource officers, and to believe them when they say what's happening. That is very critically important. And we know that Black girls, because of the representation in dominant media, believing them is not our first instinct. And then the last thing at the community level is to, again, allow girls to lead and help to frame our solutions and strategies, and listen to them when they tell you what they want and what they would like to see and what they need in their communities as resources. So the last thing I want to touch on is to thinking about best practices and solutions that other states and districts are using to lessen disparities. the first is, to support schools to create safe spaces for girls that include access to mentors and counselors in times of crisis. Again, this is not rocket science. We know what works, but taking the steps to implement them and make investments in schools so that they do have these resources, regardless of where they're positioned in a county or in a city. The second is to provide training and professional staff development that increases understanding and skills in the following topics: implicit bias, what is adultification and how do you understand it in relationship to the girls that you are working with, diversity, equity, and inclusion, female growth and development, a healing-centered approach to trauma and understanding trauma and the role that it plays in the lives of these young people, and de-escalation and positive discipline approaches, and accessing community resources and referrals. And I have to say, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, that some of this is going to require a system overhaul, a different approach to this, because some of these things are just wholly missing. And so really rethinking about where do we start, or where are we in relationship to any of these issues, and figuring out a path forward is going to be really important. The last thing I want to say is that, this report is, heart-wrenching. It is illuminating, but it's also an alarm, for us, and a call to action. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and making sure that, that this information in this report not only informs the work here, but nationally as well.
Thank you very much, Nicole. At this time, we do have a couple of questions in the chat that we want to address. Roy, I will turn things back over to you, but get us started with Beth Cravey's question from the Florida Times Union. And her question is to define adultification bias. Vanessa, Dr. Patino, Lydia, would you like to take that question?
Sure. So, adultification is the concept that children are adultified. And so the expectations around their behavior they are seen as older. And there is a whole literature growing around that Black girls in particular are adultified and at very, very young ages. And so stakeholders and people that were surveyed perceive Black girls as being older than they are, more mature, more independent, less innocent, more sexual, and thus more culpable and more accountable than their white peers. And so this concept of adultification plays out when we look at the research and we look at the findings that show how many young Black girls are entering the system at ages 6, 7, 8, 9, and being charged with felony offenses, and their white peers are not. And so it's what are the bias of authorities and educators, and how that plays out in the response to girls, to Black girls in particular. Dr. Mason may have more she might want to add.
No, that's perfect. That was perfect.
All right.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Roy.
I was just going to say, there's a question about how local concerned citizens can get involved on help with changing what is happening to Black girls. I think people want to know what they can do at the local level. We talk about a lot of policy recommendations, and people are wondering, how do we get that down to the grassroots level?
So I think it starts with definitely reading the report and understanding what's being shared in the report, and then also sharing that information with key stakeholders in your community, including school board members, so that they understand what's happening in their local communities, in their local schools, and want to have a deeper recognition of what's happening to our girls in each of those environments. It's also taking the time to meet with those individuals and say, this information matters. I want to see something different. and holding our leaders and legislative leaders and our school board members accountable so that we're seeing these changes being implemented in each of those communities and schools. And then, of course, being involved in organizations like the Policy Center, whether you sign up for the mailing list, continuously staying abreast of what are the policy initiatives that are happening in each legislative session so that you can be involved in that and be a part of that conversation.
Thank you. Stacy, I think there's a couple other questions. You want to pick one up?
There are indeed. We had a question about civil citation. Is there a common across the board reason that civil citations are not used more consistently? Who would like to pick that one up? Vicki, would you like to address that?
I think that each sheriff's department has the discretion to use it and to define it and access when and how they want to use it. And I think that's why we see the disparities. And I think Roy can probably speak more in depth to this than I can, but I think that what we're seeing is that you have communities like Duval County who has embraced it and really invested in using civil citations. And so we've seen an increase in the use of civil citations. In other communities, I think the definition hasn't been broadened enough to be more inclusive in a way that it could be.
Yeah, Vicki, I think you really hit on a good point. You know, Duval County and the circuit that it exists in is a really great example of a community that really wasn't embracing civil citation. And then leadership changed in the community, especially at the state attorney level. And civil citation went from a utilization rate in the 30s, which was one of the lowest of the major urban areas in the state of Florida. And I think it's up around in the high 70s now. We have major urban areas in the state, like Pinellas County, that uses civil citation in the 95 to 97% range. And then we have other counties that are still, you know, languishing down in the 20s. And when you look at the counties where it's languishing, you see a really high percentage of African Americans and kids of color that don't receive a civil citation. So I think Florida is going to need to relook at the civil citation statute and set some performance metrics. Law enforcement asks for discretion, and there are times when discretion is needed. But when you look at the trend data, you know, you can't imagine that the kids are that much different in the counties that are using it 20 and 30% and the counties that are using it 90%. So I think we're going to have to take a look and set some metrics for law enforcement, because after this many years of civil citation and its unbalanced use at the school level, so discretion doesn't seem to be getting the job done in and of itself.
Thank you. And another question posed in the chat: what was the most alarming finding researchers found in this study? Vanessa.
Vanessa, I can answer first, and then maybe you can add what you think. So interestingly, as Vanessa and I were conducting the research, we were in the middle of looking at 2 years worth of data. And so for what was really striking was, so last year, there were over 9,000 youth arrested and pulled into the system. This year, that number went down to 7,000. When we really started to then just track it by month, what became really clear is that those reductions are likely very correlated to school closures and the stay-at-home orders during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in some ways, the pandemic has contributed to a reduction in the number of children in the system, which really I think for me, I would say is more evidence that there are practices in school that result in Black girls entering the juvenile justice system. The flip side of that is that there's actually an opportunity that's created here, as we know that children are going to be returning back to school. What do we need to be doing differently to reverse these trends? And so I would say that that was probably kind of the most alarming fact that we uncovered.
I think for me, it was after we thought we were done, we started to dig a little deeper on the age piece, to see what were like how many girls below the age of 12 were being pulled into the system, and for what reason. And for us, it was just unbelievable that 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9, 10, 11, and 12-year-olds were being pulled in the system and being charged with felonies and misdemeanors. And these are charges that won't ever go away after they turn 18. And so that was the most alarming piece for us. And when we found it, we were like, I know we're done, but now that we've uncovered it, we can't keep silent.
Is there anywhere in the country, I'm reading the question, that is state that is getting it right and addressing these disparities? So unfortunately, I would have to say no. There are very few places. There are, states places that might be, starting some pilots, but I want to say that it's only been in the last few years that we've sounded the alarm on this as an issue, even though it has been happening for quite some time, and really articulating the problem in this way. So, I mean, it's pretty devastating, because what that means is that girls have been suffering and being pulled into the system, and we had no way of understanding the magnitude of the problem. I'm here in Washington, D.C. It is still a problem. I teach a course at Georgetown on this very same issue. And, the recommendations that are in this report, I think they are very, they are specific to Florida, but I also want to say that these are models or prescriptions that I think we can think about nationally in other states, to address many of these issues.
We have a question in the chat. What are girls in the community being charged with? And the ask is for a little more information discerning between a misdemeanor or felony. Vanessa, there you go, unmuted.
So in the community, girls are being charged with battery and assault, petty larceny, which is theft, misdemeanor alcohol offenses, and misdemeanor drug offenses. And when I say in the community, these are girls that were all eligible for a civil citation and an alternative to arrest. Now, what makes it a felony or a misdemeanor depends on the statute, if I'm correct, right?
Right. So I'd like to kind of add just some context. So for the difference between a felony assault and battery and a misdemeanor assault and battery. So assault and battery, as we know for many of the girls, is fighting. The difference between a misdemeanor battery could be fighting with a peer. The felony aggravated assault and battery could be fighting with a teacher, law enforcement officer, like hitting back the school resource officer, hitting grandma who is of a certain age. That puts it into a different category. And that's the distinction in the aggravated assault and misdemeanor battery, which so many of our girls fall into, more so than Black boys. And I think it's really, really important to pay attention to, because again, it goes back to even just gender bias, the expectations we have about girls' behaviors, fighting behaviors, and how we respond to them.
In the nonviolent arena, like theft, the difference is a dollar amount. And the dollar amount in Florida hadn't changed for a couple of decades and was hovering down around, I think it was like $250, the difference between petty theft and grand theft. So we supported an effort to raise the dollar amount. I think it's up to, I need to check the fact on this, but it's higher. I think it's around $750 now, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's really not. It's like less the cost of a cell phone. So we have to really take a look at what constitutes, you know, a theft at the level where we want to charge somebody with a felony, which is going to carry with them a long period of time throughout their lives. So there are a number of non-violent charges that should be looked at and reclassified. In fact, you know, sometimes stealing a popular shoe can be, you know, the difference between a misdemeanor and, you know, a felony, or whether you steal a lawnmower out of somebody's, you know, like near the street on the sidewalk, or versus walking down their driveway to get the lawnmower. So in the area of nonviolent, you know, theft related felonies versus misdemeanors, Florida still has a lot of work to do.
On that note, Vicki, would you like to give us some closing comments before we wrap for the afternoon?
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists today for sharing this really, really important information. We're glad this information is shared. We've been working on this report for a really long time, and it's important information, and we're hoping that what we walk away with is this understanding that we continue to criminalize behaviors that in other areas and for other youth are not being criminalized, and that the adultification of Black girls is leaving girls isolated and disconnected from our community and pushing them deeper and deeper into the juvenile justice system. And these are things that we can do something about. We can make changes. We can have an impact, and we can create different outcomes for the girls in our community. And so we're looking forward to moving some of these policies and some of these recommendations forward with our community partners. And if you have any questions, additional outreach, interviews that you would like to do, information is in the chat for Stacey Ellison, and she can help coordinate that. And we look forward to this information being shared and conversations continuing about this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Again, information is in the chat should you have any additional questions or interview requests. Thank you.
Thank you.